Welcome to AFlame Ministry, the show about the joys and challenges for people of all faith, sharing God's love in the 21st century. I'm your host, Pastor Kathleen Panning, and my guest today is Dr. Jacqueline Bussey. She's a professor of religion and director of the Forum of Faith and Life at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, and she's also an award-winning author and widely sought after speaker on topics like faith and life, interfaith peace building, and the radical love of God and neighbor. And it is my delight to have Jacqueline with me today to talk about her book, Love Without Limits, Jesus' radical vision for love with no exceptions. That's the challenge of it. So, Jacqueline, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. It's absolutely wonderful to be on your show.
And what I'd like to start with something at the very beginning of your book. On page 8, it's the end of chapter 1. And I'm going to read this last paragraph here. This is not a book about the tiny love fear teaches us to follow, fit for ants. It's about the Goliath love God begs us to borrow, fit for giants. It's about the radical love to which we are called and the surprising places it will take us if we are brave enough to believe and hold hands. I love that passage there. Why did you write this book about love without limits?
Well, Kathleen, this was a book that I think a lot of people can connect to because I wrote it during the election year here in the United States. And it was a book that I proposed in the fall of 2016 and then, wrote it until April of 2017. And at the time, and particularly when I was writing that paragraph, one of the things that I was thinking about was I was feeling a lot of sorrow and pain at the way a lot of friends and family that I knew were no longer speaking to one another just because of their opposite views on the political spectrum. And that was something that was new to me, and it seemed very divisive and aggressive, and it really saddened me, quite frankly. And I know I'm not the only one who's had that experience, unfortunately. And I thought, what can I do? What can I do about this? I'm just one person. But one thing I thought was I'm a writer. I could write about love across difference in these troubled times. And the other prompting sort of incident that made me want to do that and write that celebration of love was that I have several good Muslim friends who live here in Fargo, Moorhead, which is where I live, Fargo, North Dakota, and Moorhead, Minnesota. They're neighbor towns. Mm-hmm. And my dear friend has lived in this town for much longer than I have, and she is Muslim. And she told me a really, really harrowing story in the August of 2016. She said that for the first time ever, she had been out for a walk with a dear friend of hers, and she's Muslim, and she does not wear a headscarf. She does not wear hijab, but her dear friend does, that she was out for a walk with. So they were visibly presenting as Muslim women out on this walk, as they do, many days of the week. And they were on this walk, and she said that a man drove by in his truck and spit on them and shouted, "Go back home where you came from." Oh. And I was heartbroken by that incident. And my friend told me that story with tears in her eyes. And she said, "I've lived here for 25 years and nobody'd ever said that to me." And I thought, things are changing in our culture and we are becoming more divided. And like I said before, Kathleen, I just really wanted to do my one small part, right, to celebrate love across difference.
That's a powerful story and a powerful impetus to write the book. Yeah. One of the things you talk about is that you say the love or the lack of it is the only legacy that any of us leave behind. And you also share, and I thought this was so beautiful that you did, and that you came up with this long list, but 45 different love lessons from your mother. Yeah. And, like most of us, hopefully most of us, our parents are the first people who teach us a lot about love. And for you to be able to delineate and come up with 45 of those is marvelous. Um, and I'd like to ask you, which of those are, well, you could either say your favorite ones or the ones that are most important for you right now?
Mm. Oh, that's a really great question. Well, if you don't mind, first I'd like to just sort of talk about the list itself,
Mhm.
because like many of us out there, I have lost my mother, and she died of early onset Alzheimer's. And I actually, unfortunately, lost her when I was quite young. You know, I was 20 when she was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, and she was only 50. And so, you know, I never intended to have any part of the book Love Without Limits be about my mother, which is interesting. So that was actually just a writing exercise. So I have received a wonderful writing residency from the Gentel Foundation.
Mm.
And I would do writing exercises every day, Kathleen, to get ready, you know, to write like for the actual book. And of course I would often write about love. And the writing exercise was like, you know, pick somebody who taught you about love. And I thought, oh, I want to pick my mother, you know, because I loved her so much. She was the most amazing mother, truly. And when I was thinking about what do I know about love, I really know so much of it from her. So I thought I would love to just, you know, make a list. And I thought it'll have 10 things on it. That
Mhm.
was my actual thinking, was I would list, you know, just do a little writing exercise, 10 things. And it ended up taking an entire day because I realized my debt to her as I began to write it. It truly was a mystical experience. I felt the presence of God, or at least the presence of my mother through God, because I started sobbing while writing that, and not sobbing like out of sadness, but sobbing out of this joy that I felt my mother's presence, and I felt this enormous debt that I knew how I could repay. Because I thought, oh, I just need to keep writing what's coming through the pen, because then I can share with the world my mother's wisdom, because her wisdom was amazing. And the world lost her too early. And I have grief about that, but I also have all of this celebration about the things she taught me. So I just wanted to add that, because I've had a lot of readers say to me, I sobbed when I read
Mhm.
those pages, and I said to them, you have no idea how much I appreciate that, because I cried so much reading it. And there was a very famous poet who once said, "No tears in the author, no tears in the reader."
Ah.
And so I do think that that is really true there.
Mhm.
So as for which ones are my favorites, I guess I would have to say that, I have to take a quick peek at it. I kind of love them all because they all come straight from my mother's. But
Sure.
I really love is it okay if I just read a couple that are my
Go
favorites?
right ahead. It would be wonderful for you to do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Because these are some of my very favorites. My mother was a master gardener. And in the neighborhood where I was growing up in the South, you could have a garden year round, you know,
Mhm.
in Florida. And my mother would always win Yard of the Month, which was something that our neighborhood just gave out. And she would just win repeatedly because she was just so gifted. And I never really thought about what gardening might have meant to her until I was writing this list. So I would have to say this is one of my favorites. It's number 36 on the list. Grow a garden. It can teach you how to live.
Mm.
There are 3 secrets to gardening. 1, a patient yearning for color.
Mm.
2, a desire to catch the earth being good. And 3, a relentless belief in transformation.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
my mother was a very devout Christian, and it was only really it's embarrassing to admit, but only in the writing of that did I realize that her gardening was tied to her faith, because gardening requires a relentless faith in transformation of all things, you know, that anything can flower, you know, if
Yeah.
given enough love. And that's how my mother treated me, you know, so I really love that one. And then one other one, if you don't mind me also sharing, wear other people's joy like a fine fur. Nothing looks more beautiful on you.
Ooh.
I
You
feel that my mother, one of the things that she taught me is something that a lot of my Buddhist friends actually really value, which is a Buddhist virtue that's called altruistic joy. And it's having joy for other people, even when maybe that's something that you yourself don't have in a particular situation, you know? So that was one thing that my mother really taught me. And she really did wear other people's joy like a fine coat.
wow.
And she taught me that that's a really valuable thing to do, is to celebrate other people's joys. So.
Those are both beautiful, beautiful things. The one about gardening I really resonate with because my dad grew up on a farm and he was the gardener in our family. And because of him, I garden. Not
Oh.
like your mom. My gardens won't win any awards because there's a heck of a lot of weeds out there right now. But
Right.
something about touching the earth and
Yes.
that activity of being out in God's creation and the joy of that for me it's a beautiful gift that I gathered from my dad. So that's
I love
wonderful to
that.
hear you say that for your mom as well.
I
Yeah,
love that too. And if I could add, Kathleen, that my mother's grandparents were farmers.
yeah.
So my mother too, growing up in rural Indiana, spent a ton of time on the farm. And I think that it changed her outlook, you know, just like your
Mhm.
dad,
Yeah.
right? I remember my mother saying, if we don't grow it, if we didn't grow it, we didn't eat it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, right? You know,
Yeah. In this day and age, that's seldom true anymore. That isn't
seldom
something
true. Hmm.
seldom true.
Exactly.
You also talk about love in relationship to one's name in the book, and kind of both the names we choose for ourselves and the names that others give us, and the difference that that makes. So, what do our names have to do with love without limits?
Hmm. My short answer is a lot. I think that our names have a tremendous amount to do um, with love without limits. And I think the reason why I've learned that is actually through reading the scriptures. You know, it's so interesting how many times in the Bible that God or Jesus changes someone's name. It happens all the time. You
Mm,
know, we have the story of Jacob wrestling the angel, you know, down by the river, and then Jacob's name changing to Israel, you know, becoming the name of an entire people, but meaning, you know, one who wrestled with God, which I think is so beautiful. We have Paul, you know, in the New Testament, whose original name was Saul, you know, which was his Hebrew version of that same name. But it's very significant that after he has his conversion to becoming a Jesus follower, he doesn't want to go by Saul anymore. He feels like a brand new person, new in his faith and transformed, and wants to go by Paul. So there's countless examples, right, that I could give of this. And in particular, Jesus, when he's dealing with his disciples, he is almost always changing their names. We often overlook that, but
right.
again, I believe it has to do. I love that you asked this question because I think it also has to do with what I was saying about gardening. I think that God has a relentless belief in our ability to flower and bloom,
Mm,
and a lot of that is reflected in Scripture by a name change, saying this person has become a new person. The old is dead, and the new is born. You know, and so I just think that's very powerful. It gives me chills even to think about that. And I do think that how does this translate into our world today is extremely important. You know, just recently I was reading a study. It was very sad to read. It was about names and the names of students of color in public schools, and how often the teachers who were predominantly white were mispronouncing the names. And it was looking at the effect, or changing the names, just like shortening them and calling a Chinese student instead of her real name, maybe calling her Lisa. And calling and looking at the effects of that, like on the young people and on their self-esteem. And of course, it had very negative results, which I was not surprised to see at all, given sort of my scriptural study and passion about names and calling people by the right names, even if it's difficult to remember or difficult to pronounce or anything like that. So seeing the negative effect that it was having on the self-esteem of just, you know, elementary school students to not be called by the right name, I think is enough to give us attention. And one of the things I talk about in Love Without Limits is the ways in which I'm not always called by the right name, and this has given me at least it's a wellspring of compassion for other folks for whom that's happening on a maybe more serious level, because a lot of people just don't call me Jacqueline. I'll meet them and I'll say, hi, my name's Jacqueline. And in 2 seconds, they're like, oh, hi, Jackie.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, that's not what I prefer to be called. And when they say that, the truth is, that it's not just like, oh, I'm offended. That's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is the minute they change the name, I don't feel like they know me. I feel like they've misidentified me. I lose a connection to them in that moment. So I'm very meticulous about this with the people in my life, and my own students. I'm like, okay, do you want to go by Michael or Mike? Because I know that it matters in our psyches, the connection that we have with another person. So I think that, we also have a lot of things going on in our society right now that some would refer to as political correctness. I actually would avoid that term. As someone who is repeatedly called by the wrong name, I don't think that is about political correctness. I think it's about love. So when my friends who are, for example, indigenous folks say that they don't want to be called Indians, I say, absolutely, I will never use that term. That's not what you want to be called. You feel that is a misperception, of course, because it is. They're not from India, right? They're Native Americans or indigenous people. I just ask people what they want to be called. Like I have a friend who is a wheelchair user. He does not want to be called, somebody with disabilities. He'd rather be called a wheelchair user. And I hear the empowerment in that, and I wouldn't have thought of that. That's definitely a mistake that I had made in referring to him as a person with disabilities. He's like, Jacqueline, I would prefer if you would say that I am a wheelchair user. And so, see, I don't think that's about political correctness. I actually think it's about love. And because the Bible teaches us to call people by the names that they want to be called.
Yeah. You're so right. I mean, I get that too with my name. People automatically shortening it from Kathleen to Kathy, and that was the nickname I had as a child growing up, and so it automatically kind of puts me back into that childhood mode instead of adulthood and who I am now, and things like that. So yeah, you're right. What's in a name? A lot.
Exactly. Yeah.
In the name, it's our identity. It's who we are, and being respectful of that is so important. And that I like what you said. It is a way of showing love to someone else, and that's really, really important to do. You go on. There's a lot in this book, and we're not going to be able to cover it all in this show. But on page 155, and I'm going to find it in my book here, you have a quote from an indigenous author, and I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Martin Prechtel.
Prechtel.
Prechtel, okay. Would you be willing to read that quote?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, just for our viewers, this is from a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, which is a very beautiful title. It's a very beautiful book by Martin Prechtel. In The Smell of Rain on Dust, indigenous author Martin Prechtel argues that all genuine grief is actually a form of praise. He writes, quote, "Grief is praise. By the event of our grief and by our wailing, we are also simultaneously praising with all our hearts the life we have been awarded to live, the life that gave us the opportunity to love deep enough to feel the loss we now grieve. If we do not grieve what we miss, we are not praising what we love." End quote.
Yeah, I've found that to be a very, very powerful passage, and I'm wondering what it means to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's such a beautiful passage, as the entire book is, quite frankly. What it means to me, as a person who, I really spent a lot of my life grieving my mother's death. She died slowly, early onset Alzheimer's is a very cruel disease. I know that you know about that. And I'm sure a lot of other people have had an experience too, living with a loved one who suffers from dementia. And you know that even though the person is still present, there's a part of them that is not present anymore. And that's the part that had a connection with you, and had a relationship with you that they could remember. So it's a very unusual kind of grief. The person is alive, and yet you are grieving the death of a part of them. And for me, that quote really spoke to me, because I spent 16 years of my life, grieving my mother's slow death, day by day. And when I read that, I thought, oh, I absolutely love this, because it allows me to still continue to be a faithful person as I grieve. Because I think there can be a kind of a misperception among some Christian communities that grief is faithlessness, right? That if it's too negative, right? We're not believing in hope and the resurrection things. And I don't think that that's true at all. When Jesus lost a best friend, Lazarus, Jesus cried, Jesus mourned, Jesus lamented. And when all the people around him, including Lazarus' own family, Mary, Martha, etc., as they were crying, Jesus didn't say to them, oh, buck up, little camper, and, stop grieving as a person who doesn't have hope. Jesus didn't say any of those. There's no grief shaming. There's none of that. Instead, Jesus grieves even though Jesus knows he's going to resurrect Lazarus. So what does that teach us? I mean, to me, it teaches what this quote is saying, that grief is natural, it's organic, and it's God-given. And it's a way that we are able to share with the whole world out loud, through our salt tears, how much we truly cherish that person and how much we miss them. And that is only possible if we truly loved them. And I talk about in the book, one of the most revolutionary insights I was able to come up with, I think, doing all this reading on grief and just spent in time with prayer about my mother's own death and the death of course, my best friend. I've lost a lot of people in life, as have we all. Was I realized that grief has a secret upshot, is what I call it in the book. And the upshot is it's proof that love outwits death.
Ah, yes.
And I believe that firmly. Because imagine if it wasn't true that love outwits death and outlasts it and outruns it, then if a person died, all of our love would just die with them. There would be no grief. Be like, oh, bye. And that's not the way anyone acts. And why? Because love lives on and love speaks last. Yeah. And to me, that's so powerful.
Yeah. And it's you talk about the passage of Jesus crying as Lazarus has died. And I've heard so many different ways of talking about that text, some of which are not very helpful and not very true to scripture either. Yeah. But to frame it in the idea and that you just shared, that love outlasts death. And, for those of us who are left when a loved one dies, that's a reminder that their love does not die because it stays in us. Mm-hmm. And our love certainly doesn't die with them either, because we still love who they are, who they've been in our life, and all that they have shared with us.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in a way, they continue to live on through our love.
Yes, I agree. And even through our grief, I think they continue to live on. Because then we want to talk about them with other people. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, that's a celebration of who that person was.
Right. Yeah. And, thinking about all of the funerals and everything that as a pastor I have been involved in and the like. And in fact, the very first part of my ministry was a lot of funerals, the first parish I served. And it was a growing experience, a bonding experience for that community as well. But it was a way of celebrating those lives, and celebrating and remembering and sharing the stories and of the person, even in the midst of the funeral and the grief and the tears. And I've always encouraged people to do that. And so what you share here is really, really powerful for that. That grief and love are not antithetical to one another. They are part of one and the same.
Yes, that's a beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yes, and I was actually just attended a funeral last night, and it was a funeral for a dear Jewish friend. And her husband, who is also Jewish, shared something really beautiful at the service. It's really in line with what we're saying here. He was talking about that for him, being a follower of Leah in the Bible, we may remember who Leah is, that she had the child Judah. And he was explaining that all Jewish people are called Jews because of Judah. It's short for Judah. But there was also the way in which Leah was heartbroken because she felt that her husband did not love her or love Judah. So it was very interesting. So he's talking about that for him to be a follower of Leah meant to believe that gratitude was possible in the midst of heartbreak, because that's who Leah was. And I had never, ever heard that interpretation. And I found myself crying. We were all crying. It was one of the most inspirational eulogies, and it was about his own wife that he was giving. And he was an inspiration to us, at this funeral, in just almost the way that you had described, but believing in gratitude in the midst of heartbreak. So beautiful.
Wow. That's beautiful. And that's the way we're going to have to leave this episode of Flame Ministry. And Dr. Jacqueline, I really appreciate you being here. Please give our viewers a way that they can learn more about you and keep in touch.
Yes, please. You are always free to follow me on social media. Be a friend on Facebook. So it's just Jacqueline Bussey, but also www.jacquelinebussey.com. You can follow all of my speaking engagements. I'm regularly speaking around the country, or J Bussey on Instagram.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jacqueline. And so for everyone else, this has been one way of showing God's love, radical love without limits, no exceptions to that. And so until our next show, I encourage and challenge everybody to find every day one way to show God's love to someone, and at least 3 things that you're grateful for, and to write them down. So God's peace until our next time together. Welcome to AFlame Ministry. This is a show about the joys and challenges for people of all faiths about sharing God's love in the 21st century. I'm your host, Pastor Kathleen Panning. And my guest today is Dr. Jacqueline Bussey. And actually, she's coming back for a second show, but just so you know who she is, she's a professor of religion and the director of the Forum on Faith and Life at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. She's an award-winning author and widely sought after speaker on issues like faith and life and interfaith peace building and the radical love of God and neighbor. Interesting topic. And we started at the first segment of these two. So for anybody who didn't see the first segment, first episode of this, please go back and watch our first show. And we're talking about her book, Love Without Limits, Jesus' radical vision for love with no exceptions. And that word no is underlined in red in there. So Dr. Jacqueline, welcome to the show. It's great to have you back to continue our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to see you.
Your book on Love Without Limits has a backstory to it, which we did not talk about in the first show. It was censored. And so please tell our viewers what happened. Share that story with us.
Yes, well, it was a very painful experience, to be sure. So I was contracted to write a book which happened to fall during the election year. And I decided to write a memoir and a practical how-to guide for love across difference in these troubled times, because I was seeing that a lot of folks were divided, particularly across the political spectrum, weren't speaking to each other anymore. And I felt a lot of stress about that. So I thought, okay, this is one thing I can do. I can write a book about this. So I proposed that to I was at that time signed with a very large Christian publishing house, one of the largest in the world. And they loved the proposal, loved the topic of love without limits. And so I proceeded to spend the next 9 months writing the book. I went on leave from Concordia College, and I received a generous advance from that publisher so that I could be paid and live off of that money while I was going on leave from my regular job teaching. And I completed the manuscript on time, and I was so excited. I felt like it was just my heart on the page, basically. All of these stories from my own life, true stories about love without limits, and how I'd learned to love bigger and better, and who taught me to do that. And unfortunately, when I sent it to my editor at that large company, he called me on the phone and said, well, we love the book and we're excited to publish it, but there's one issue. And I said, what's the issue? And I'm quoting him now. He said, it's the gays and the Muslims. And I said, what about them? And he said, some of the stories you're telling are not in line with the values of the majority of our readers. And proceeded to say that some of them were theologically out of bounds. So then they proceeded to rewrite 2 chapters in question, and I was not allowed to accept or reject changes on that. They just actually rewrote it, and it was almost 4,000 words that had been cut from the original manuscript, all from the 2 chapters. One was on a chapter from some of my LGBTQ friends, and one was a chapter on my Muslim friends and how they taught me to love bigger and better as a Christian. And they made some serious cuts, and I was faced with a really terrible choice, Kathleen. And the choice was I could make the cuts, get to keep the money, publish the book, keep the contract with this prestigious press, or I could refuse to make the cuts and lose the book, basically, as well as the salary, etc. And there was only one choice that my soul could live with, of course. I remember thinking, what choice would I make if my students were here to see me making this choice? And of course, the choice was I refused to make any of those cuts. They were all political in nature, in my opinion. And they would be a violation of my faith and my integrity. And so I refused to make them. And then the press said, well, we paid Jacqueline to write the book, so we own all of the rights. So unless we get paid back every penny of the advance that we already gave her, we're keeping the book. I'm not going to publish it, but no one else can publish it either, right? So basically, I lost the rights to my own story. And it was a very painful experience in so many ways. And so for months, I was silenced and didn't tell anyone what had happened. But then something really amazing happened, which was I had a dear friend who said to me, she said, you know what, Jacqueline? They just want you to shut up and disappear. And you've given them exactly what they wanted. And for some reason, those words broke through all the silence that I felt. I felt just powerless and defeated by this huge multinational corporation, right? Mm-hmm. But when she said that, I thought, there is one thing that remains to people who've been silenced like me. I remember thinking that. And that is, I can stop being silent. I can tell my story. So I marched home that very day, and I just wrote a short piece on social media. I don't name the publisher. That's not important to me. Many of us sometimes refuse to love without limits, so it's not just about them. So I just wrote a short piece about what had happened and how much it hurt, and that I'd lost the rights to my own book and to my own story. And to my surprise, the post went viral. And within just a few hours, people were sharing and resharing with CEOs even of another press. And someone tagged the CEO of Fortress Press, who now I know was a wonderful person. And she said, I think we'd be interested in this book. And so as it turned out, after only 24 hours of that post, which is like light speed for the publishing industry. It's not how that works at all, right? We had an offer on the table to help me buy back the rights to the book from that large publisher. And it was enough that that we were able to do that and get the rights back. And so then the book was published with Fortress Press. Here's a copy of the book. And in there, we actually included the blog that I did on Facebook that went viral and sold the book, because one of the things I didn't say was I actually took a photo of myself, Kathleen, on that day, because to post with the blog, because that's how social media works, right? I wanted a picture that captured how I felt on the inside, and the way I felt on the inside was captured by this picture. It's a selfie that I took with duct tape across my mouth saying censored, because that's how I felt. So it was a story with a very painful beginning, but with one of the most redemptive endings of all time. So
yeah, it's so interesting that they wanted to limit the love that you were talking about, of love without limits. No
exactly.
exceptions.
I know.
Yeah, some exceptions to that. So, and what you talk about is, I mean, it's a reality that many face, and not just some Christian faiths, feel that homosexuality is wrong. And so how does your Love Without Limits respond to that? Share some of what you share in the book about that, the story.
Yeah. Well, for me, I do strive to be a follower of Jesus. And if there's one thing that I feel confident about as I read the scriptures, it's that Jesus consistently hung out with outcasts and whoever his society was saying was other. For example, Samaritans. Samaritans were the religious other in Jesus's own day. And when people are insulting Jesus, they call him a demon-possessed Samaritan in the Bible. And who does Jesus choose to talk to, hang out with? Samaritans. So much so that we all are probably familiar with the so-called Good Samaritan parable, in which Jesus lifts up an other that other people viewed as completely sinning, as completely having a false faith, right? Worshiping incorrectly, etc. Jesus lifts up that person, as he says in the Samaritan parable, that we should all go and do likewise. So he's lifting up a person that people, perceived as other, as the person we should actually go out and imitate. Mm-hmm. So this teaches me something very powerful. It makes me ask in my own day, okay, who did I grow up being taught is other? In what other kind of way, And one of the things that I should add here is that when my editor censored the book and they rewrote the chapters in question, they had to retitle the chapters, because the chapters on my LGBTQ friends and my Muslim friends had titles after my friends' names. But when the stories of those folks were cut, what are you going to call the chapters? And my editor's solution to that was to combine the chapters into one. And he came up with a title for the chapter. And the title was Others. Others, in all capital letters. And I was absolutely heartbroken, because the whole point of my book is that in God's eyes, no one, no human being, no exceptions, is an other. It's just not true. I don't believe that that is the case. So Jesus never mentions a single thing about sexuality. There are other passages in the Bible that can be interpreted to be talking about that, and I'm very aware of that. And the way I look at this, Kathleen, is, I don't insist that everyone agree with me, right? But I do have very strong views on this matter, because I believe that Jesus taught a love doctrine. He taught unconditional love, and it was agape. And so when I look at passages in the Bible, I think, oh, are they ascribing to agape or not? There are passages in scriptures that talk about that we should stone children to death for disobeying their parents. We don't believe that. We don't do that. We are a community who interprets the text using our hearts and minds that God has given us. And there are many communities and I'm a part of one. I'm a part of a national church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, that has decided that that is not sinful. That we believe that given today's science about sexuality and the way that there are genetic factors that determine this, that these are people just as God intended. and we are all called to love one another without exceptions. So that's kind of where I stand on it. I just say, if I'm going to be wrong, and I know many people think that I am, and I love you also without limits, just so you know, if I'm going to be wrong, I want to err on the side of love always. So I'm just erring on the side of love that's too big rather than too tiny.
That's, that's a wonderful way to talk about that. Erring on the side of, what do you err on the side of? And I think that's a question each of us has to face at some point or other in our lives. If we're not 100% certain, or if there's any possibility of something, where are we going to err? On the side of love or on the side of rules and regulations that are human, or beliefs that are, human and developed, or centuries old that may not have any validity today. I mean, Bible teaches us that the earth is flat too. I mean, from Genesis. So
right.
very few people believe that anymore.
Exactly. Yes.
So, it's a good policy. What do you err on the side of? Side of love. So yeah. You write also about something you call the single story.
Yes. Yeah.
Please explain that.
Absolutely. And for those of you watching, I'm taking that phrase from a fabulous TED Talk that I highly recommend you go out and watch when you have an opportunity. It's only 15 minutes. And it's called The Danger of a Single Story. And it is by she is a Christian author, Catholic Nigerian author named Chimamanda Adichie. She's a best-selling author. This is an amazing TED Talk. And what she means, and I mean by the single story, is the way in which we tend to, as kind of a political tool, socio-political tool, we take a group of folks and we tell a single story about them. Let me just give you an example. It's the best way to break this down.
Yes.
If when I go out and I'm speaking about, for example, Islam, and I will even just say to an audience, I'll say, I'm going to say one word, and you tell me honestly what you think of. So I will say Muslim. And invariably, Kathleen, I've never been in any room where people did not immediately shout out terrorist or ISIS, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what we mean by a single story. Now, of course, it's not the case that there's just a single story about Muslims, right? You could make the case that there's a single story about Republicans in the United States. There's a single story about Democrats, because I also test that out on audience, and they all know the answers to that too, So it's very unfortunate the way in which we're falling into single stories about one another. And the other day, I heard the commentator Van Jones speak at a conference called Revolutionary Love that fabulous conference. I loved it. And Van Jones, if you know anything about him, it's just brilliant. And he said something that I wanted to share today. He said, we've been tricked into hating each other. And I thought, oh, wow. He's so right. He's so right. We are allowing these single stories to stand in for real human beings who are complex, multi-layered, who don't even all agree on any. I mean, to think that all Muslims agree on any one thing is hilarious, right? I mean, it's 1.6 billion Muslims in the world who live on all different continents. And to think that they're all think the same about things, it's just, it's entirely false, in the same way that obviously Christians do not all believe the same. I mean, if you just even compare the Amish, for example, to, Episcopalians in the United States, this is not the same at all, not even sharing the same views about if we should use electricity or not, right? So it's terrible, quite frankly, the way that we fall captive to the single story. So in my book, I'm urging that when we truly follow God, that one of the things we do is we stop the single story. And when we hear it, even, we give a mild no. There's way more to that than that. I have a friend who is, X, Y, and Z, right? And being able to offer that is just very powerful, and is a way we live out compassion in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, when you talked about that single story, it reminds me of a community in Omaha, Nebraska, where when 9/11 happened, the Jewish community in Omaha formed a human chain around the Muslim community center, a human chain of love around that center. And from that has grown out a whole ministry where there's now a campus with the Muslim community, the Jewish community, and a Christian church, all sharing the same, not the same buildings, but the same campus. And in the center of that, there is a common building where they come, or that they're going to build that. And so, I mean, talk about destroying the single story.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a beautiful example of that kind of thing. And I'm sure there are other stories like that that I don't know about, but, you know, our viewers may know about. But yeah, anything else you want to add about your Muslim friends and their story that you have learned, and how they have helped you grow in love?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I would just add a story to the marvelous story you just shared about Omaha, because in my book, I tell some stories too about Muslims in, I think it was Pakistan, where some Christians were being persecuted, who form a prayer chain around a Christian church so that Christians can have their prayer in peace. And again, that trounces the single story in the same way that the story that you told did, because people think, oh, Muslims and Jews don't get along, can't get along. Oh, Muslims and Christians can't get along, don't get along. These things are false. These things are false. That's part of the single story. And it's true that sometimes, in some places, some people are not getting along. But assuming that that's everyone is just so damaging and fills us with despair, right? So that's why I think it hurts so much. Yeah, but I also talk about my Muslim friends in the book, and how they've helped me deepen my faith as a Christian, which is, I think, surprising to some people. But I can give a very concrete example of this. Mm-hmm. So there is this concept within interfaith peace-building work that comes from Christopher Stendahl, who is a Lutheran theologian. And he came up with this term, he called it holy envy. Ooh. And he said, when you're doing interfaith peace building, you have to allow room for holy envy. And by which, he didn't actually define it, but I understand him to be saying, right, for allowing room for that desire within yourself to have more of some aspects of that tradition within your own. Right? So something that you can just look at and say, wow, that is so beautiful. I love that. So I had an experience of holy envy when I was in a predominantly Muslim country. So I was traveling with a student to Oman, where we were doing some speaking on Christian-Muslim dialogue. And of course, where we were staying was in the heart of the capital of the country. And there were calls to prayer 5 times a day, as there would be in any predominantly Muslim country, most likely. And, they're very loud. The bells that ring, like, having never really been around that much in my life, right, growing up in the United States, I was surprised by how loud they were. Well, and if you know anything about the 5 prayers per day within Islam, then you know that one of them is before the sun comes up. And my student and I were very jet lagged. We traveled all the way, to the Middle East, to Oman, and we were hoping for a good night's sleep, right? And right before, it was probably 4:30 a.m. It was long before we were going to get up, but it was right before the sun was coming up. We hear this incredibly loud call to prayer. And I was cranky about it, not going to lie. The first time it happened, I was like, wow, I would rather be sleeping. But then as I observed, whenever I was with my Muslim hosts traveling in Oman, it didn't matter what you were doing, because you would stop everything for prayer. So even if you were in a store and someone was maybe going to make a sale, right? Mm-hmm. Faith is more important than money, right? So you would stop. The cashier would be like, oh, time for prayer. Must stop. And go into the back of the store, do prayers, and then come back and resume the transaction. And, I've never seen anyone do that in the United States, Christian or otherwise, right? So I was like, wow. And this began to dawn on me. So my Muslim friends, a lot of them have apps on their phone that lead them to, the bell will go off, right? And they will stop what they're doing and pray to God. And at first, while it was making me cranky, with like this sort of like waking me up so early, by the end of my stay in Oman, I was filled with holy envy because I realized that my Muslim friends structured their entire life around their prayers to God. And I actually structure prayers around my life. I do the reverse. And I don't really feel that good about that, quite frankly. When I thought about it, I thought, what devotion to God that I would lose sleep every day because prayer is more important than sleeping. I mean, you got to admit, that's some pretty powerful love of God right there. And so that is one of the things that my Muslim friends have taught me, and it really deepened my faith as a Christian, because then when that call to prayer began happening, I started getting up and doing my prayers as well. So
wow. That is powerful, and that would be a challenge for me too.
Right? I know, right?
Yeah. Especially before dawn.
Right.
I tend to be more of a night person, and so getting up early.
Yes.
It's tough. But thinking about that, I mean, you've talked a little bit and alluded to this at times in our conversations, both today and in our first show, that we live in a world where there are so many divisions, and that those divisions are highlighted and they're even encouraged in many, many ways. How can we love those we disagree with, and especially the people we don't even like?
Yeah. I have an entire chapter on this in the book, and I wish I could say to you that I have an absolute answer, right? I could solve all the world's problems if I had that. I don't have an absolute answer, but I do have some suggestions. And one thing that I talk about in the book is that it's a mistake to think that agreement will ever unite us. God never said that. Jesus never said that. What we're told will unite us is love. And I say in the book, understanding and agreement are not the same thing. I always say that to my students all the time, because I think we have a mistaken perception in our culture that they are. And understanding and agreement are not the same thing. They never were. I think we can think of examples where we may have understood what someone that we care about did, even though we totally disagreed with the choice that they made, right? And so I think we have to tap into our deep wisdom that we actually do possess in that regard. Love demands only understanding and not agreement. And once we understand that, I think we have some space to move. I also think I tell stories in the book about how difficult it is to love people who don't think, act, pray, believe, dress, worship the same way that we do. The people who do all those things like we do, they're easy to love, right? That's easy. And I do think that God made love a commandment because God knew if God just made it this fun option, like an intramural or extracurricular option, that nobody would sign up if it was like beach volleyball or, no, God understands it has to be a commandment. And one of the things I share in the book is my sense that love is not an extracurricular. It is the curriculum. It's the only curriculum we have in front of us. So lately these days, Kathleen, when I encounter someone with whom I disagree, and believe me, of course it happens on a daily basis, one of the things that I do, instead of immediately rushing to silence them, right? Because part of us, part of our impulse or human impulse is, I just want them to stop talking. But as someone who was silenced and censored for the love that I was trying to tell, I know that doesn't work. Me being censored didn't even stop that book being published, but it also didn't stop me from speaking every weekend of this entire semester on that book somewhere. I dug in my heels even more to that book's message, right? I'm faithful to the message because somebody tried to shut it down. And people don't respond well to that. So I have to honor that as well. Even when people are saying things that I feel like are hate speech, sometimes I have to say, okay, is the solution for me to silence them? I don't think that's going to work. Right? So instead, lately what I do is someone's saying something that I adamantly disagree with and I feel is violating someone's dignity, I'll say, can you please talk to me about why you believe that?
Yeah.
And I am shocked at how many times there is an actual story, just as there is about the stories. I have story. And then I hope that then I say to them when they're done, do you mind if I share why I disagree with that? And it often is a story about my Muslim friend, or, a story about my Republican friend, or my, LGBTQ friend, or whatever. So once we create a space for the story that is not part of the single story, I think that stories can change lives. And I think most of all of the research even these days shows us that friendship is actually what changes the world. How do we know this? Well, the researcher Robert Putnam in his book American Grace looks at the ways in which people's views become more positive of a religious tradition that is not their own. And what the researchers discovered was that people who have, for example, a negative view about Muslims or Mormons don't have a single Muslim or Mormon friend.
Right.
And the research showed that people who did have one good friend of a tradition that was different from their own had a positive view about that entire group of folks. And then they found another surprising thing they did not expect. They kind of hoped for that result. But what they also found was that, for example, if I'm a Christian, I have one Muslim friend, that's going to make me have statistically significant, more positive views of Muslims. But the research also showed that I had more positive views of every other religious tradition as well, of Hindus, of Jews, of Baha'is, of atheists. And that was sort of an unexpected finding. And I think the secret there is because once you figure out that these people were trying to be tricked into a single story and you reject it, you see that this whole world opens up to you. And you see that truly that science that I just quoted proves that friendship changes the world.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's very, very powerful. Thank you, Dr. Jacqueline, for being with us again today. Please let our viewers know how they can find out more about you.
Absolutely. You can go to www.jacquelinebussey.com, and that's my website. You can see where I'm speaking. You can reach out to email me through the site, or you can follow me on Facebook, Jacqueline Bussey, or J Bussey on Instagram.
Thank you again, and thank you all for viewing today, for watching with us. Come back again next week or next time for another show. And each day as you go about your day, please find some way to share God's love with someone, and think of 3 things, at least, that you are grateful for every single day. So God's blessings to you all. Until next time.